Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Ben Armstrong. He is a research scientist at the Industrial Performance Center and Initiative for Knowledge and Innovation in Manufacturing. He will present good automation, bad automation, how we can shape the technologies transforming work. So basically, we will learn if we still have a job after this meeting, right?
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for coming. It's great to see this turnout. It's my understanding that this is the first or one of the first in-person gatherings for the first. Oh, this is terrific. So I'm really glad to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. Today, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the work of the future activities at MIT, as well as my own research on automation in the workforce. And I'll try to keep my remarks brief so we can have a little bit of a discussion back and forth and respond to some of your questions and interests. So first, I want to start by getting a little specific, and this is really the puzzle that I'm interested in, is three sets of occupations that are picked because they're representative of a lot of broader categories of work in the United States and around the world. The first, let's see if this pointer works. There we go. The first is a machinist. This is a picture of a lathe operator in the 1940s in the aerospace industry in the US. The second is a healthcare administrator, but you could think of it as back office administration, doing routine tasks mostly at a desk on a computer. And then the third is a bus driver. And what research over the last 10 years has told us is that all three of these occupations are vulnerable to automation, that we have currently workers interacting with technologies to do tasks like producing parts for an airplane, entering data into electronic health record software, or driving a bus along a fixed route. And what we've been told, and what technology has promised us, is that we're going to have some kind of robotic lathe to perform the same task. We're going to have maybe a chatbot or robotic process automation to enter that data. And finally, we're going to have an autonomous bus that's going to be able to do the same route. And I think the big question that a lot of us have in this debate is, are the negative consequences for workers offset or worth the trade-off in terms of the positive surplus for society? And frequently, the economics research and research even in engineering has tried to evaluate whether these trade-offs are sufficient. Will the surplus allow us to create more new jobs than the jobs we've been losing to automation? Are those jobs better? And today, I want to get into a little bit of more detail on what happens to those workers who have been displaced. How big is that surplus, which is really what a lot of these questions hinge on? How dramatic are the benefits of these technologies? And then finally, what's up to us? A lot of times we assume with automation that we're technology takers, that really this technology comes to us, it's going to affect the labor market, it's going to affect our lives, but we can't really shape it in one way or another. Essentially, the robots are coming, we need to adapt one way or the other. And at MIT, our approach has been quite different. We look at this technological change as something that we can affect, and it's really endogenous to this whole process, that we can make design decisions, we can make organizational decisions that lead us to better outcomes as a result of automation rather than worse ones. So this is really the framing of our approach to automation in the workforce and what we call our Work of the Future project. And I'll give you a little bit of an overview of what we found so far and then some next steps for this research. So in 2018, we had a task force convened, 18 faculty from across MIT, who developed dozens of working papers and research briefs that were investigating different aspects of these questions that I just presented to you. They worked with an advisory board of CEOs from around the world who are also interested in these workforce challenges. And here's a bit of what they asked and what they found. So first, there was this question of aggregate impact. How are the technologies that you saw, robotic technologies, artificial intelligence technologies embedded in software, how are they affecting work, both the tasks that people do as well as the availability of work? Second, what decisions can we make? How can we shape these technologies? And then finally, what is the role of outside agents like government institutions, civic institutions that can support workers as they adapt to these new technologies? And I would encourage you, I'm not going to be able to get into all the details of the reports from this venture, this more than 2-year-long venture that was convened by President Raphael Reif. But if you're interested, all of these documents are public at workofthefuture.mit.edu, and they've also been summarized in a New York Times report at the end of the session. But the big headline finding was that contrary to a lot of the pessimism in 2018, 2019, that as many as 50% of jobs were vulnerable to automation, that we haven't yet seen those effects on employment in the data. As you can see from pretty tight labor markets around the country, it's not as if the jobs aren't available due to automation, but that the nature of employment has changed. And the key finding is that the aggregate number of jobs isn't changing, but the quality of jobs is. So while automation contributes to widespread productivity gains for a lot of industries, those productivity gains have not translated into shared prosperity for workers. So what are we doing next, building on this report? Really, we want to figure out a way of marrying those productivity gains, those innovations, something that we're focused on a lot at MIT, with good outcomes for workers. How do we align big gains in technology with better wages, higher job quality for workers who are interacting with those technologies? Now, where does this lead us from here on out? So I want to take 3 findings from our preliminary research and then map them on to where we're going in this research, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on my work and can share with you some examples. So first, one of the interesting findings that is intuitive but hasn't really been documented thoroughly is that technology is having 2 effects right now. One is a displacement effect, that it's taking away tasks that some individuals have done as part of their daily jobs. And then the second is an augmentation effect, that new technologies are creating new types of work, jobs that never existed before. And the question is, can we, if we're interested in better outcomes for workers, promote that augmentation effect, creating better, higher quality jobs for workers, as opposed to that displacement effect? So this is a summary chart from a figure from a paper from David Autor, who is a co-chair of the Work of the Future Task Force, along with his colleagues Anna Solomons and Brian Seidmiller, that shows, and you could see in just to walk through this chart a little bit, on the left in each industry is the blue bar. Those are jobs, the level of jobs in 1940 employment. And then you could think of as turquoise or maroon bars are jobs in 2018. The occupations that existed in 1940 are in the bottom, and then the jobs that didn't even exist yet in 1940 are on the top. And the key finding from this work is that a majority of the jobs done today didn't exist less than a century ago. So there's a lot of churn in the types of occupations, the types of work that's being done. And this is part of a broader project that David Autor is working on to document, to link patents, the new innovations, to the jobs that they've created that we can see come up in census data. And it's really exciting work. Just to give you a little bit of a decade-by-decade summary of what these new jobs might look like, you can see that in 1940, and we talk about welding, and I had the lathe operator at the beginning, an automatic welding machine operator was first came up in the census in 1940. And then now in 2000, you have an AI specialist as a new job. And in the same process, there are jobs that are going away, that are no longer going to be performed. So a computer as a job, someone who would actually perform the computational functions, washed away as a job due to displacing technology. But new jobs, like a certified medical technician, can emerge. The next big finding, and that I previewed, was that you see big increases in aggregate productivity, which is you think of as value added per worker, but you haven't seen increases in wages. So here's just our summary chart of this that's in the final report for Work of the Future. On the bottom here, median compensation and compensation for what we would think of as middle or low wage workers, production and non-supervisory workers, so non-management occupations, versus average compensation, right? Gap between average and median is really driven by those that wage growth at the top, as well as productivity gains. So where are those productivity gains going if they're not going to workers? Maybe they're reinvested in capital, they're going toward increases in profits, but they're certainly not shared broadly in wages. Okay, the final piece, and I think that this is a bit counterintuitive, but really important for our work, is that these technological changes, the technological changes that many have highlighted around artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies, large data sets that can help us make decisions in a better way, they're not coming tomorrow, at least widespread within firms. That the technologies that we see widespread today, we knew about 30, 40 years ago. That many of the technologies that we're developing now at universities and laboratories, they're not going to be widespread in firms for multiple decades. So one of the findings, and I think very encouraging findings of our team, was that we have some time. But we can't just sit around and watch our timepieces and wait. We actually need to adjust in terms of education and training while those technologies are filtering into the workplace. I do work on robotics in manufacturing, and despite large advances in robotics, a very small number of firms have actual industrial robots working, and the industrial robots that are on factory floors have pretty limited capabilities. So in terms of training the production workforce to adapt to robots, we still have time, even though robots are on the factory floor. So there are various changes that we at MIT can make to how we train our engineers, as well as how we can share curricula and the skills needs with other educational institutions around the country. So that's a focus of ours. And finally, I want to get into some more detail about what are the interesting or maybe counterintuitive findings along these lines that we've done so far. So we have a few different areas that are occurring. I can go into any of these if they're of interest to you and share the presentation. But we have a team of 14 faculty members that are signed on to this next wave of automation and the workforce research. And the work that's associated with this effort is pretty diverse. So on the upper left here, Julie Shaw and Dave Kaiser are the associate deans of the social and ethical responsibilities of computing. And they're both, they're scientists. Dave's a scientist and Julie's an engineer, but they're working with philosophers to understand what's a process that engineers and technologists can go through to identify the implications of their new inventions for workers and for society, such that there can be more of a deliberative process and more preparation when those technologies come into the market and for the consequences that they might have. I mentioned a bit of David's work with colleagues on new work. What are the technology effects on new work creation? And then also over here, this is work led by Kim Kimmerling, and I'm part of this team, where we're working within the state of Massachusetts to figure out what training curricula and institutional changes for the community college level might need to be made to create middle skill pathways for manufacturing workers. Finally, I'm going to maybe indulge myself on a little bit of kind of a preview of findings that haven't been published yet or have been released in limited areas, going back to these three occupations. And I'm particularly fascinated with these because you could think about manufacturing. This is a job that we know in the US is declining, but still very relevant for US competitiveness. We think about that as maybe a relevant job, relevant area in the pandemic response. Healthcare administration is a job category that's overall growing, and we might not be as concerned about automation because healthcare jobs are growing in aggregate. This worker might find another opportunity, even if a software program replaces many of their tasks. And then finally, bus drivers. This is a topic that I think has been on a lot of our minds as autonomous vehicles have been trialed, and there are more and more experiments. And I was excited to do some work with bus drivers and have them ride autonomous vehicles and see what they thought. So the three headline findings of research with these three occupations, first is that there are conditions in which automation can make someone's job better and not displaced, that you can actually improve job quality for incumbent workers by automating. And the question is how do you do that? The second is that there's a trade-off, and this comes from the healthcare industry, between how deep an automation technology can go, how much it can transform an organization, and how much it will be accepted by the workforce. And that trade-off, I think, is a big question for, I know, a lot of managers who would want buy-in from the workers who are going to be affected, but also really want to see returns from the introduction of a new technology. And then finally, that in surveys that we've done, we see a widespread acceptance of new automation technologies and excitement about new technologies that affect work. But at the same time, when you see those technologies come into the workplace in practice, there's a lot more friction. So when you ask a worker, do you like automation, or how will automation affect your productivity or job satisfaction, they're open to it and excited about it. But when you observe it on the ground, it's quite a different story. So there's a little bit of a paradox there. And I'll walk through one by one here. So I've been doing research funded by the Department of Defense on US manufacturing, particularly in the defense industrial base. And one of the questions is, how do US manufacturers adapt to the demand for new products? So if you're a manufacturer, you have a factory of less than 500 people, and you get a new order, and the order is asking you to develop something new, what do you do? And the consistent answer from a lot of the factories I talk to is we figure out how to do it within our existing workforce and our existing capital equipment. We don't really want to invest and take new risks if we don't have to. But among the firms that I've worked with that actually do take new risks and buy new equipment, I've seen multiple different outcomes. In some firms, you see the firms demand new skill and look to upskill their existing employees. In other firms, they look at buying new technology as a way of reducing their demand for skill and their need to recruit new employees. So just as a visual here, so you could think about this as just a very toy model of a factory floor where you have a machinist operating some kind of CNC lathe. And then when you introduce automation, one of the options is you take your machinist and you put them into more of a checker role where they're checking the quality of the part. They might be loading the part into the equipment, and you have the robot do much of the other work. And then you have someone who's programming the robot in a different role that has higher skill and is working across the factory. So this is one option, which actually for these firms, they find it very valuable because no longer do you need to recruit a skilled machinist with a lot of experience who can hear the quality of the cut on the part. Instead, you could have a temp off the street who you could train very quickly to do this lower skill, lower wage role. And then the challenge becomes, how do you find this higher skill person of whom you need fewer to hire into your firm? But an alternative option, and one that I find much more exciting, is the firms that say, this is an opportunity for us to take our incumbent worker who knows our process, who actually knows what needs to be done within this cell, and they become a cell manager, learning how to program the new machines that are brought onto the factory floor. Now, the trade-off here is that firms that make this decision, they don't do this for all their machinists. Typically, it's not something where the entire crew of production workers goes and gets new training on these machines. It's typically they take the most successful machinists who are already working on these machines, they get additional training, and they have a much better job opportunity. Maybe they were making, one example is, at the lower level of a machinist, someone's making 40K, they move into this job of a programmer, they're making 60K, which is even above someone who's programming a CNC. So there's, I think, an exciting possibility here for retraining incumbents, but the challenge right now is even firms that do it, they don't make this decision as a widespread investment across the workforce. And then finally, I'm encouraged, and I know that later today there are going to be some startups presenting. I'm encouraged by startups in manufacturing. So one of the big issues with small and medium manufacturers is low technology adoption. And the exception to that in the manufacturing community is startups, which have launched their firm recently, and you could think intuitively, have a higher baseline of technology that they've invested in. They're typically better at data collection. They're able to make more efficient decisions with actually lower initial capital costs. And what I've heard from startups is they don't want to go through the bother of hiring production employees because they're very hard to find, takes a very long time to train. They'll just have engineers do the engineering as well as whatever production work needs to be done. And they'll try to build an entirely engineering-based workforce. Now, on the one hand, I think the startups that we see are far more productive than legacy firms. But on the other hand, this workforce implication isn't so, I think, desirable at a societal level. It means, and it isn't sustainable necessarily for the startups as they scale. So this is, I would say, an unanswered puzzle. Now, you might be asking, so what differentiates the firm that wants to rely on temps and hire in individuals at a lower skill once they buy a robot versus the firms that want to upskill when they acquire new technology? And there are really two factors here. Those firms that are upskilling are kind of in that upper right quadrant. They're willing to take risks on reorganizing production. So it's not as if they're just layering new machines on old and trying to keep individuals in the same occupations. They're willing to actually transform, let's say, a production line into a cell. And they're also willing to partner with other organizations on training. So the industry backgrounds in the room, as some of you might know, the technology vendors have made a larger move into training. When they make a sale, they also offer training with the sale. And a lot of these companies that we see reorganize their production are willing to invest in that training, which is rare and comparatively rare in manufacturing, when they purchase that new equipment, which is kind of exciting. On the flip side, those firms that are more likely to rely on temps want to do all their training in-house, and they really don't want to change much of what they've done in a legacy. I think there are some reasons for this that I can get into, but I do want to cover these other examples. So this is the new research that we've done with a large hospital organization and trying to study their introduction of robotic process automation software. So what this hospital system did was they saw an opportunity that a lot of their back office work was leading their hospital administrators to do rote tasks that they didn't seem to like. And they were saying, okay, so how do we take away the lousy work from our administrators and have them focus on these more challenging, more complex, interesting pieces of their work going forward? And how can we measure that to make us more efficient? So initially they hired a consulting firm. Consulting firm came in and said, here's the software you would use, and you could essentially program bots to do the routine tasks that your administrators were doing. Now, they said, okay, that sounds great. How do we do this? How do we implement it? And the consulting firm, which had worked with lots of companies, both in, in financial services and healthcare, on introducing robotic process automation, said, well, there are three models. One model is that you could have your upper management, the folks that have a higher level view on what needs to change and what organizational transformation you want to introduce, and they can pick out the areas to emphasize for automation, and you really drive automation from the top down. The other model that you could do is you could essentially survey the workforce that's doing these routine tasks, and you could crowdsource ideas from them, and then evaluate those ideas, and then start from the bottom up. And then the hybrid view is that you could kind of have some combination of both directions. And what this hospital system did, you can see this is the top down, the bottom up in the bureaucracy on the left. What the hospital did was they opted for a bottom-up strategy. And it's been interesting to study in part because I'm surprised with how many workers who are either developing the automations or their teams are affected by the automations that are really welcoming this new technology that takes away some of their work, that takes away some of their tasks. And it's because these are tasks that they've identified that they don't like. And it's a very, I would say, inclusive and democratic process that they've gone through. But one of the frustrations for management is that they've only really picked off the low-hanging fruit. They haven't gone into the areas that the workers on the ground wouldn't be able to identify because they're so focused on their own tasks and their own routines, or B, that would really upset the workers might be able to identify, but they wouldn't want to do it because it would disrupt more of their core functions. So this is a trade-off that I would say remains unresolved, and for a lot of these organizations, they're figuring out. They have one hypothesis about how to do this, but I think it might have negative consequences for the workers that have really been coming along to this point. And then the final case comes out of work on an autonomous vehicle pilot, which was autonomous vehicles that were free public transit and really going along a bus route that hadn't been fulfilled by a public transit agency. And I'll keep the transit agency anonymous. So, I came into this research thinking that many individuals are skeptical of autonomous vehicles. They're skeptical of new technologies in general. This is from a Pew study where it says, in general, Americans are worried more than excited about new technologies. And I thought if we apply this in the autonomous vehicle realm, particularly around public transit, the people who are most worried about this would probably be bus drivers, who would see their work as transit drivers be affected by this change. And when we did surveys, this is a survey done at Brown University by my colleague Rick Locke and I, on, in general, I'll just read aloud the question that we asked folks. This is a nationally representative survey of 1,000 people. In your current job or the job you most recently held, have technologies and automation made the following? This is productivity on the job, your job satisfaction, your job security. Have they made them better or worse? And 4 and 5, where they made it somewhat better or a lot better. 1 and 2, where they made it a lot worse or somewhat worse. 3 was they haven't really had any effect at all. So the plurality, no real effect at all. But if they take one position or other, they're far more likely, these workers, to say the automation made their job better than worse. Now, if we look at this and we think about the broader literature on automation affecting low-wage workers, we'd think the people in 4 and 5 probably have pretty good jobs. They're probably college educated, and they have pretty good prospects when technology comes into their employer. But actually, it's the opposite, that people with college degrees are more likely to be in the 1 and 2 category than people without college degrees. So we were really puzzled by this and still trying to figure out why are the people who the literature tells us are going to be most affected by automation the most optimistic about it, or at least the least concerned about it. So we designed this study of bus drivers who were who drove near this line that had been turned into an autonomous bus route, and we asked them a number of questions in focus group questions before riding on the autonomous shuttle, and then we asked them to ride on the autonomous shuttle, come back, and really answer the same battery of questions about how they thought autonomous vehicles would affect their work, their productivity on the job, their job satisfaction, and their job security. And here's what we found. We found that in terms of productivity, a lot of bus drivers thought more thought it would be these autonomous vehicles would have a positive impact on their productivity versus a negative impact. It's a little harder to think about what that means for bus drivers, so we asked them some follow-up questions. And then the harshest finding was that a lot of bus drivers, before riding on the vehicles, thought that they would have a negative impact on their job satisfaction. They'd take away the thing that they really loved, and a lot of these drivers said, well, I got into this because I really like driving. I like being out there and driving, and that was a big part of what they thought they'd like about it. And then after riding the vehicles, you see the kind of striking, no one thought that, none of the drivers thought this would have a negative effect on their productivity, and there were quite a few drivers who flipped on job satisfaction and actually thought this would be a good thing for their job. So we saw we have a relatively small sample of bus drivers who were participating in our study. I think there's a reasonable critique that the bus drivers who participated are probably more open to this technology than the bus drivers who stayed at home. But we did work with the drivers union, which was very skeptical of autonomous vehicles at the beginning and tried to make sure that we made this open to all drivers. And I really do think it's a remarkable finding. And we have a few different theories of why this could be the case. One is that the drivers initially thought the technology was much further along than it actually is. So they thought maybe that the bus could drive itself entirely. But when they got on the bus, they realized that there were a lot of tasks that they do as part of their ordinary work that the bus can't do, that the autonomous vehicle can't do. And that was, I think, reassuring for some of the drivers. And then the second was just that in the focus group discussions, the ride on the bus, I think, reinforced for a lot of drivers all the variety of tasks and all the variety of value that they provide as a driver. So they're able to give directions to passengers. They handle a fare box. They would go through all the different aspects of their jobs that were complex and the timing that was challenging. And they thought, oh, maybe this will just make me a safer driver. That was the thing. Maybe these sensors can just make me safer, and I can still focus on these other aspects of the job that are really important, which are more customer service oriented. Now, where does this leave us? And this is something that we're still trying to puzzle through in the research. And that's that, there's a lot of motivation, I think, from managers and from firms to introduce new technologies, to become more productive, competitive. And the question is, how willing will workers be to go along, and what will the long-term effects be on workers? So I think, in principle, there's an openness, certainly, from workers, even those that we associate with lower skill occupations. But when you actually do introduce the technologies, there are still barriers, like the training that we saw on the factory floor, and that automation in the worker's head, when you ask them a survey question, might look totally different than when you introduce it on the ground, like a healthcare organization that might be using automation to totally eliminate a team and create a new one. So this paradox really relies on a lot of organizational decisions and some technology design decisions that I didn't get into, but these are what we're focused on as part of our Work of the Future effort. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. So is there any initiative by the government to train and provide new skills to the workers who are among the next to be replaced by robots and automation? Well, thanks for that. So there have been a variety of training initiatives over time, federally driven training initiatives, to help workers affected by these types of issues. The Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, is one of the most prominent ones. That was meant to help workers whose jobs were shipped overseas, due to globalization. And the studies of that program have found it not to be very effective at all. And in general, federal training efforts we haven't found good evidence of their success. So how do you retrain effectively? And how do we find better jobs for workers after retraining is still a nut that really hasn't been cracked. There are good examples of very sector-specific training. So when you get employers in a sector like IT that collaborate on a curriculum and target a specific population to train them and commit to hiring them, those efforts have been associated with success. But these broader multi-sector national efforts driven by government actually haven't borne a lot of fruit. Don't most companies look to robotics automation technology as a way to reduce labor force and costs, not create alternate roles for employees? Yes. So this is a really interesting question. So I would say there are a couple challenges here. So one is that when I talk to companies in manufacturing, normally they have many open roles already that they've been unable to hire for. And manufacturers over the last 10 years have their demand for new workers has increased dramatically. It's become one of their highest priorities, even beyond some of the traditional priorities like improving their technology. So unable to hire these workers, some manufacturers that wouldn't have automated have actually turned to automation technologies. But this doesn't, automation technologies can only handle some of the tasks that they were hiring for. They're not a complete solution. So I would say, yes, it solves some of the workforce problem, but the demand for labor is still so high that it actually doesn't totally eliminate the demand. Now, this gets back to some of David Otter's work that I would say some strategies are, let's look for technologies and automation to displace workers and reduce labor costs, and also for some employers just to increase quality of output, more repeatable, less prone to error. But for other firms, it's to say, how do we make our existing workforce more productive and take away the things that they might not be equipped to do to help them focus on their real skills? And I think those firms highlighted in that upper right of the manufacturers are really, they have a lot of faith and a lot of, they're excited about the creative potential of their workforce and the ability of their workers to find new ways to produce, let's say, new components that they might be able to get orders for. Do I have data on changing attitude and automation during the pandemic? I will. So we have a colleague in Sloan, Paul Osterman, did a survey on worker attitudes toward training pre-pandemic, of course not knowing that this was attitudes toward training right before the pandemic. And we're doing a second wave of that survey of many of the same respondents post-pandemic, where we're going to include a lot of questions about automation and new technology. So we're going to be able to have this nexus of training and education questions along with technology questions. So I can say stay tuned to that, but the survey hasn't come back yet. What are 2 or 3 roles that will never be automated? So this is, I think, a really important framing. So a lot of the, I would say, research from consulting firms who've put out briefings on this, and they're trying to measure the vulnerability to automation of different occupations. And you can see, in this new work, old work research that there are some occupations that just go away due to technological change, right? All the tasks that they had previously done have been eliminated by technology. But I don't typically think about, an entire role being automated or not automated. And I teach and do research, and a lot of my tasks have been automated and will be automated, I think, with advances in remote learning, in better teaching and learning platforms. And I hope that they are, because I think that will mean we'll be able to provide better education to students. And then there are some things that I do that I certainly hope and don't think will be automated, like coming up with new research designs and new research questions. So I think about it more as, if a job's a bundle of tasks, you could see some jobs where a higher share of the bundle might be automated or won't be automated. But I think there's a vulnerability of some of that bundle in any job to be automated. And then, of course, when some of the bundle of your job gets automated, you might be able to take on new tasks, or your job might be redesigned or reconfigured. And I think that's something that we really should embrace, that reconfiguration of occupations, rather than resist. And one thing that I like about David's new research with colleagues is that he shows that this is it's a very dynamic environment for occupations, and that the jobs that our children have might be something that we wouldn't recognize at all, and that's, I think, pretty exciting. Could it be that widespread adoption of technology into industry is slowed by the need to effectively train a wider workforce rather than we have time? So I've asked employers this question in manufacturing, you know, and it's actually quite the opposite. You know, it's that employers are resisting the technology, and they have that resistance to the technology has conditioned their demand for workers. So it's not as if employers are saying, I wish that I could buy that robot, but I have no one to program it. It's that I'm seeing people coming out of community colleges that can program these new machines. I don't need them. I need someone to run a manual machine. So I'm actually seeing in my work the opposite, and this is a lot of our work with the Department of Defense is trying to figure out, you know, if we're the assumption of the federal government is sometimes that we have a skills gap, which means that employers are far ahead in their technological capabilities and the workforce is lagging behind. And as a result, there's been a lot of investment in trying to improve training for advanced manufacturing technologies. Now, what we see in the field actually, particularly among SMEs, 98% of the manufacturing firms, is the opposite, that they're seeing workers who are maybe capable of more advanced skills than those firms can actually support. So one of the questions for government is like, if you build the training infrastructure for advanced technology, will the workers come? And it's or will the technology come? And it's unclear. I think we really need to work on technology adoption among firms. What's the next job to be automated that will displace workers on a scale of hundreds of thousands? I'm really not sure. Let's go. Government policies that would be helpful in preventing further increases in wage inequality due to automation. So this is great, and I think there's a few ways of doing this. One is for policies that subsidize capital expenditure. So in Massachusetts, we have a program called M2I2 that when firms, particularly small firms, are ready to acquire new technologies, the government says, we'll cost share with you because we understand that you're risk averse and you might not want to buy this new technology. But right now, there isn't really an emphasis when we incentivize firms to upgrade their technology to also invest in training. And we look at that technology investment as a really good opportunity to train your workers, and that among firms that do train their workers, I think there's a higher likelihood that the organizational decisions will be to upskill existing workers rather than to displace them. So I think that when we do focus on, from a public policy perspective, subsidizing new technology, there should be training paired with that. Let me see any finals. I know there's 1 minute left. Oh, the regional issues. Thank you. This is actually one of the areas of research I focus on. So some of you might have seen reports that 5 to 7 metro areas, the Seattles, Bostons, San Jose's of the country, are responsible for an enormous share, really the majority of growth in tech jobs. And that these places, as you probably know, they have a legacy of very high wages, and their wages are only going up. It also happens that these places are associated with hollowing out, that the number of jobs for very high wage workers in the coastal tech hubs is growing, and the number of opportunities for low wage workers are really growing. So some of my research, my colleague Liz Reynolds, who's now at the White House, is focused on what are the places that have a strong middle? What defines places that aren't hollowing out in that same way, but have growing opportunities for middle-skill, middle-wage workers? We see places like Eau Claire, Wisconsin, St. Cloud, Minnesota, places that have a diverse set of industries, either in manufacturing or in services, that are able to support a growing number of middle-wage jobs. And then we've also worked on some research on where's the future of manufacturing in the United States? What are the places that have really thrived even as the growth of Chinese import competition, the so-called China shock, has affected them? And this is, I think, exciting because none of the places that have done really well in manufacturing are the places that have grown along other metrics. So we see these as alternative models of growth for maybe places like Pittsfield, Massachusetts, that has a manufacturing legacy but hasn't really transitioned to high-tech services. So we're having discussions about how to apply the models of places like Tulsa or Grand Rapids, Michigan, or Ames, Iowa, all of which have experienced a lot of productivity and wage growth in manufacturing, and how we could use lessons from those places to apply them elsewhere. So that's my time, but thank you very much for these questions. They're really good. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of them.